The man had just locked the door to his small coffee shop. Outside, a steady drizzle slicked the pavement, blurring the streetlights into long, watery streaks. He was about to walk to his car when a strange woman approached, soaked to the bone and clutching a faded canvas bag to her chest. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the words barely more than a whisper carried on the damp air. "Can you please help me?" For a brief moment, as the wind shifted, he caught the scent of cheap, acrid cigarette smoke clinging to her jacket. A strange detail, because no one in his quiet neighborhood smoked that particular brand. He looked down and met her eyes, panicked, yet unsettlingly familiar. The single father's heart clenched as a memory he had buried for 10 years suddenly surged forward, indistinct but sharp. Who was she? Why was she here, in the middle of a rainstorm? And why was that canvas bag so heavy that her hand shook from the strain of holding it? He didn't know it yet, but this single moment would pull him and his daughter into a vortex of secrets, where the only escape was to expose the truth in front of everyone. The final turn of the key in the lock echoed with a satisfying click, a sound that marked the end of another 16-hour day for Ethan. He ran a tired hand over his face, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans on his skin, a constant reminder of his life's work. The daily grind was his sanctuary, a small corner of the world he'd built from nothing after his wife passed away. Now, at nearly 10 o'clock at night, the empty cafe behind him was dark and silent, its warm, earthy aroma a stark contrast to the cold, wet air that greeted him on the street. The rain wasn't heavy, but it was relentless, a persistent drizzle that gave the asphalt a dark, mirror-like sheen. He pulled up the collar of his jacket, his thoughts already turning to home, to his daughter Lily, who would be asleep by now, her breathing soft and even in the quiet of their small apartment. It was in that moment of transition, between the world of work and the world of fatherhood, that he saw her. She emerged from the shadows of an adjacent alleyway, a figure made hazy by the rain and the dim glow of the streetlights. Her approach was hesitant, each step seeming to cost her a great deal of effort. She was drenched, her dark hair plastered to her forehead and her thin coat offering little protection from the October chill. In her arms, she held a large, weathered canvas bag, clutching it with a desperation that seemed to go beyond merely protecting its contents from the rain. As she drew closer, he could see the tremor in her hands and the stark pallor of her skin. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uneasy. "Can you please help me?" she asked, her voice a fragile thing, easily broken. Ethan's first instinct was caution, the reflexive defense of a man living in a city that had its share of trouble. He should have just shaken his head, offered to call a cab or direct her to the nearest shelter, and continued on his way. But he didn't. There was something in her posture, a profound weariness that spoke not of a single bad night, but of a long, arduous journey. And then he caught the scent again, the one from the hook, a sharp, cheap tobacco smell that was utterly out of place. It was the kind of smell he associated with dive bars and bus stations, not the clean, quiet street where his coffee shop stood. It was the first detail that didn't fit, the first small crack in the ordinary facade of the night. He took a half-step closer, his brow furrowed with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" he asked, his voice low and steady. She flinched at the mention of calling someone, a subtle but definite reaction that did not go unnoticed. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted nervously down the empty street before returning to his. It was then, as she looked up at him fully, that the second, more jarring detail struck him. Her eyes. He felt a sudden, inexplicable jolt of recognition, a phantom feeling of familiarity that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. It was like seeing a face from a dream, a face he knew he had seen before but could not place, lost in the fog of a long-forgotten memory. The feeling was so strong, so disorienting, that it momentarily stole his breath. "No, No police, she stammered, shaking her head. Please, I just need a place to stay. Just for the night. I don't have anywhere to go, and I think someone might be looking for me. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. He looked from her haunted eyes to the canvas bag she was guarding so fiercely. It was a simple, drab olive tote, but it looked unnaturally heavy, pulling her shoulder down and causing a visible strain in her forearm. What could be inside that was so important, so burdensome? His mind raced, constructing scenarios of a woman on the run, a woman in deep trouble. Every rational thought told him to walk away, to not get involved in something that was so clearly complicated and potentially perilous. Yet he couldn't shake the unnerving feeling of connection, that ghostly flicker of a memory tied to her eyes. He thought of Lily, safe and warm in her bed. What if one day she were the one standing in the rain, desperate and alone? The thought was a physical ache in his chest. He was a father. He was a man who tried to do the right thing, even when it was difficult. He let out a long, slow breath, the vapor clouding in the cold air. The decision he made in that instant felt both reckless and unavoidable, as if it had been made for him long ago. All right, he said, the words sounding foreign in his own ears. My apartment is just a few blocks from here. You can stay for the night. Get dry. We can figure things out in the morning. Relief washed over her features so completely it was like watching a mask fall away, revealing the raw exhaustion beneath. Thank you, she whispered, the words thick with an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. She introduced herself simply as Claire. The walk to his apartment was a tense, quiet affair. She stayed close to his side, constantly glancing over her shoulder at the empty, rain-slicked streets behind them. Ethan found himself doing the same, a strange, borrowed paranoia creeping into his own senses. He was acutely aware of the weight of the bag she carried, and the faint, unsettling scent of smoke that trailed after her like a ghost. When they finally reached his building and climbed the 2 flights of stairs to his door, he felt a profound sense of crossing a point of no return. He unlocked the door and pushed it open, and as the warm, safe light from within spilled out into the dim hallway, he stepped aside to let her in, a complete stranger who felt like anything but. The scent of rain and cheap smoke followed her over the threshold, and a quiet, unshakable feeling settled in his gut. Nothing would ever be the same, ever. Ethan woke before his alarm, a rare occurrence. For a moment he lay in the pre-dawn stillness, trying to identify the source of his unease. It wasn't a sound, but a presence. A subtle shift in the very air of the apartment, a low-level hum of dissonance in the quiet symphony of his home. Then, memory rushed back in, sharp and clear. The rain, the scent of cheap tobacco, the unsettling familiarity in a stranger's eyes. Claire. She was asleep on the couch in his living room. He slipped out of bed, his movements practiced and silent, and went first to his daughter's room. The door creaked softly as he pushed it open. Lily was a small lump under her comforter, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. He watched her for a long moment, the fierce, protective love of a father warring with the anxious reality that he had willingly brought an unknown variable, a potential danger, into this sacred space. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, for the risk he had taken. When he entered the living room, he found Claire was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, perfectly still, the gray light of dawn filtering through the window and casting long shadows across the floor. She had folded the blanket he'd given her with meticulous care and placed it on the cushion beside her. The faded canvas bag, he noted, was on the floor directly at her feet, close enough to touch. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide and alert, like a forest creature startled by a sudden noise. There were dark circles under them, suggesting a night of little to no sleep. "Good morning," he said, his voice a little rough. "I was about to make coffee. Would you like some?" She simply nodded, a small, grateful gesture that seemed to require all her energy. The domestic ritual of grinding beans and boiling water was a comfort, a small piece of normalcy in a situation that felt anything but. The rich, warm aroma filled the kitchen, a familiar scent that felt like his territory, starkly contrasting with the lingering, foreign scent of rain that clung to his guest. The true disruption began when Lily awoke an hour later. Bounding into the living room, her bright red hair a tangled mess, she stopped short at the sight of the woman sitting on their couch. Her initial surprise quickly melted into open, unabashed curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked, her head tilted. Ethan, standing in the kitchen doorway with a spatula in his hand, held his breath. "Lily, this is Claire," he said gently. "She needed a place to stay for the night because of the storm." Claire offered a small, hesitant smile. "It's nice to meet you, Lily." To Ethan's astonishment, his daughter, who was often shy with new people, walked right over to the couch and sat down. "I like your jacket," Lily declared, pointing at the worn coat draped over the back of the sofa. "My dad's are all boring colors." The simple, honest compliment seemed to disarm Claire completely. A genuine warmth touched her eyes for the first time, and the tense lines around her mouth softened. The interaction set the tone for the day. Lily's innocent acceptance acted as a bridge over the chasm of Ethan's suspicion, forcing him to see the woman, not just the mystery. Later that morning, as Claire was helping him clear the breakfast dishes, an offer she had made so quietly he almost missed it, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. It was Mrs. Gable from next door, a woman whose heart was as good as her penchant for neighborhood gossip was strong. She held a plate of muffins, a pretext for her visit that was as thin as the paper doilies she favored. Her eyes, however, went straight past Ethan to where Claire stood in the kitchen. "Oh, Ethan, I didn't realize you had company," she said, her voice laced with a careful curiosity. He made the introductions, and Mrs. Gable's smile was polite but strained. As he walked her to the door, she leaned in conspiratorially. "I don't mean to pry, dear," she whispered, "but you know there have been a few break-ins on the next block. Just some petty things, packages stolen from porches. You just can't be too careful these days with who you let in." She patted his arm, leaving her words and the weight of their implication hanging in the air. Ethan closed the door, his jaw tight. It was a classic red herring, a seed of doubt planted by a well-meaning neighbor, and despite himself, he felt it begin to take root. The rest of the day passed in a strange, suspended reality. Claire was a ghost in their home, speaking only when spoken to, moving with a quiet grace that made her seem to take up less space than she did. She spent most of the afternoon sitting in the armchair by the window, her gaze lost on the street below, her hands never far from the canvas bag. Yet she was slowly being drawn into the orbit of his daughter's life. Lily, it turned out, was determined to make their guest feel welcome. She showed Claire her collection of drawings, a vibrant portfolio of dragons and castles. Ethan watched from his desk as Claire knelt on the floor, listening with rapt attention as Lily explained the backstory of a fearsome but misunderstood griffin. He saw a gentleness in the woman, a deep-seated kindness that seemed at odds with the haunted look in her eyes. It was a confusing and contradictory image, and it only deepened the mystery that enveloped her. The moment that shattered his carefully constructed neutrality came that evening. It was long after dinner, and a profound quiet had settled over the apartment. Lily was in her bed, but she was restless, her mind still buzzing from the day's unusual events. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, trying to soothe her to sleep, humming a tuneless melody. From the living room, where Claire was ostensibly reading a book, a new sound emerged. It was a soft, melodic humming, a note-perfect continuation of a song Ethan hadn't heard in 10 years. He froze, his hand hovering over Lily's forehead. It was a lullaby, a strange and beautiful melody with no words he knew of, something his wife, Sarah, used to hum to Lily when she was just a baby. It was their song, a secret piece of music that had existed only within the sacred walls of their small family. He had thought it had died with her, yet here it was, drifting from the lips of a stranger, as clear and certain as a memory. He slowly stood up and walked to the bedroom door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Claire was on the couch, her head leaned back and her eyes closed, humming the melody as if she had known it her entire life. He stared at her, the questions in his mind so loud they felt like a physical scream. The red herring of the petty thief, the fear of the unknown pursuer, it all vanished, replaced by a far more profound and terrifying question. This wasn't just a stranger anymore. This was someone who held a key to a part of his life he thought was locked away forever. The melody faded, leaving a silence in the apartment that was heavier and more profound than any sound. Ethan stood in the doorway of his daughter's room, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the woman on his couch. The lullaby, a fragile ghost of a tune, still echoed in his mind, and with it, a torrent of memories he had carefully packed away. He remembered the quiet evenings in the hospital, humming that same wordless song to his wife, Sarah, a private language of comfort between them. He remembered her humming it to a newborn Lily, her voice a soft murmur against the baby's downy hair. It was a melody that belonged to the dead, a secret kept by ghosts. For this stranger to know it was not just a coincidence. It was an impossibility, a violation of the natural order of his life. He walked slowly into the living room, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the quiet space. Claire opened her eyes, startled, sensing the shift in his demeanor. The peaceful, sleepy expression was gone, replaced by the familiar mask of a hunted animal. "Where did you learn that song?" Ethan asked. His voice was quiet, dangerously so, stripped of its earlier warmth. He tried to temper his tone, to remind himself that Lily was sleeping just a room away, but the question came out harder than he intended. Claire's face went pale, and she sat up straight, pulling her knees to her chest in a defensive posture. She stared at him, her mind clearly racing for an answer that would not betray her. I don't know," she finally stammered, looking down at her hands. "It's just a tune. I must have heard it somewhere a long time ago. I don't remember where." The denial was weak, transparently false, and it did little to quell the storm raging inside him. He knew she was lying, but he also saw the genuine fear in her eyes, a fear so profound that it silenced the angry accusations rising in his throat. Pushing her now would only drive her further away, or worse, out the door and back into the rainy night, taking her impossible secrets with her. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, and retreated, both physically and emotionally, leaving the unasked questions to fester between them. The next morning, Ethan focused on restoring a semblance of normalcy, a ritual for Lily's sake as much as his own. He made pancakes, her Saturday favorite, and the familiar smell of melting butter and maple syrup temporarily pushed back the apartment's underlying tension. He and Lily ate at their small kitchen table, a silent agreement passing between them to not speak of their guest, who remained secluded in the living room. Afterward, he took Lily to the park. He needed to feel the open air, to see his daughter run and laugh under a clear autumn sky, to remind himself of the simple, tangible world he was fighting to protect. As he pushed her on the swing, but trying to pump her legs to go higher and higher, her joyful shouts echoing in the crisp air, the weight of his dilemma settled on him. He was caught between two powerful duties, the duty to protect his child from a potential threat, and a deeper, more unsettling duty to uncover a truth that felt inexplicably tied to his own past. "Is Claire going to stay with us forever?" Lily asked on the walk home, her small hand tucked into his. "She's nice, but she seems sad." The simple, empathetic observation from his 10-year-old daughter struck him more deeply than Mrs. Gable's suspicious warning ever could. That evening, after Lily was in bed, he knew he could not let the silence continue. He found Claire by the window again, staring down at the streetlights as if memorizing an escape route. He made 2 mugs of tea and set one on the end table beside her. She flinched at his approach, but didn't pull away. "We can't go on like this, Claire," he began, his voice calm and measured. "You're in my home, with my daughter. I'm not going to ask you to leave, but I can't help you if I am completely in the dark. You said someone was looking for you. You were afraid of the police. You have to give me something." He watched her profile in the dim light, the way her throat worked as she swallowed. He saw the internal battle she was fighting, the conflict between her instinct for self-preservation and her desperate need for an ally. For a long time, she said nothing, and he thought she would refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, trembling whisper, thick with a fear that was chillingly real. "They aren't the kind of people you can run from. Not forever," she said, her eyes still fixed on the street below. "They're powerful. They have money, connections. They can make people disappear. Calling the police would be like sending them a roadmap of where to find me. It would only make things worse, for me and for anyone who helps me." She turned to look at him then, her gaze pleading. "I never should have come here. I'm putting you and your little girl in danger." As she spoke, her voice breaking with emotion, she raised a hand to wipe away a tear, her frayed sweater sleeve sliding back an inch. In that moment, a flicker of movement under the lamplight. Ethan saw it. On the delicate skin of her inner wrist was a small, pale scar, shaped like a perfect crescent moon. The sight sent another jolt through him, a shock of recognition even stronger than when he had first looked into her eyes. It was a memory, sharp and sudden. A little girl, years and years ago, tumbling off a bicycle. A frantic phone call. Sarah, his late wife, rushing to her younger sister's side. He remembered seeing that exact same scar as a doctor cleaned the wound. The memory was so vivid, so specific, it couldn't be a coincidence. But it was impossible. Sarah's sister had died in a car accident 15 years ago. Everyone knew that. He said nothing about the scar. He kept his expression neutral, burying the fresh shock beneath a calm facade. The puzzle pieces were beginning to connect in his mind, forming a picture he did not understand and wasn't sure he wanted to. Her story of being pursued, combined with the impossible lullaby and the ghost of a scar from his past, solidified his resolve. This was no longer just a matter of helping a stranger. It was something deeply personal. He was connected to this, somehow. Lily's observation echoed in his head. She seemed sad. He looked at the terrified woman before him, a woman who carried not only a heavy bag, but also the heavier burden of secrets. He made a choice. "You can stay," he said, the words feeling both like a promise and a sentence. "You can stay here until we figure out what to do next. We'll be careful. We'll figure it out together." In her eyes, a flicker of disbelief gave way to a wave of profound, exhausted gratitude. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had just stepped past a point of no return. A fragile and unspoken truce settled over the apartment in the days that followed. A new routine, layered awkwardly over the old one, began to take shape. Ethan would wake, check on Lily, and then find Claire already awake in the living room, a silent sentinel watching the city slowly come to life. They would share a quiet breakfast, the air thick with the things they did not discuss, the lullaby, the scar, the unnamed danger that had followed her to his doorstep. During the day, while he was at the coffee shop, he arranged for Mrs. Gable to look in on Lily and Claire, a decision that felt both necessary and deeply ironic. He trusted the kindly neighbor to keep Lily safe, yet he knew her watchful eyes were also a source of suspicion directed at the very person he was trying to protect. He found his own senses were heightened to an almost painful degree. Every unfamiliar face at the cafe, every car that idled for too long on his street, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He was living on a knife's edge, caught between his quiet, orderly past and a future that felt dangerously uncertain. The first time he saw the car, he dismissed it as a coincidence. It was a nondescript black sedan with tinted windows, parked halfway down the block from the daily grind. He noticed it because it was a newer model than most cars in the neighborhood, and it sat in the same spot for over 3 hours. The next day, he saw it again, this time parked across the street from his apartment building in the evening. A flicker of unease turned into a cold knot in his stomach. He started paying closer attention, deliberately altering his route home from work, walking an extra 2 blocks just to see if he was being paranoid. On the third day, his fear was confirmed. As he left the cafe, he saw the sedan parked at the far end of the street. He ducked into a bookstore, watching from the window as the car slowly drove past, the driver a faceless silhouette behind the dark glass. Later that night, while taking out the trash, he saw a man standing under a streetlight across from his building, his face obscured by shadow and a pulled-down hat, his gaze fixed on Ethan's third-floor window. The man quickly turned and walked away, melting into the darkness. But the image was seared into Ethan's mind. The threat was no longer a vague story. It was real, and it was watching them. He locked the apartment door, his hands trembling slightly as he engaged the deadbolt. He found Claire in the kitchen, helping Lily finish a drawing at the table. He waited until his daughter was safely in her room with a book before he spoke, his voice low and urgent. "They've found us," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "There's a car. A man. They're watching the building." Claire's reaction was immediate and visceral. All color drained from her face, and she stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a cry. The flicker of hope that had begun to kindle in her eyes over the past few days was extinguished, replaced by the familiar, raw terror he'd seen on the night she arrived. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "How? I was so careful." The sight of her profound fear solidified his own resolve. He was in this now, completely. There was no turning back. "Who are they, Claire?" he pressed, his voice firm but not unkind. "You have to tell me everything. I can't protect you. I can't protect my daughter if I'm fighting shadows." She sank into a kitchen chair, her body trembling. For a long moment, she just stared at her hands, her breathing shallow and ragged. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a grim resignation. "The company I used to work for," she began, her voice barely audible. "It's a multinational corporation called Omnigen. On the surface, they're a legitimate agricultural and pharmaceutical company. They project an image of innovation, of helping the world." A bitter, humorless smile touched her lips. "I was a junior auditor in their financial department. I was nobody, just a kid checking spreadsheets. But I found something, an anomaly in an account linked to a research and development project. A project that was officially shut down for safety reasons years ago." She took a deep, shuddering breath. It was still active. They were still funding it, secretly, funneling millions of dollars through shell corporations. They were falsifying safety data for a new pesticide, covering up evidence that it was causing catastrophic environmental damage and severe health problems in test communities. They buried the reports. They paid people off. I found the proof. A whole trail of laundered money and falsified documents. I was never supposed to see it. Her story tumbled out. A torrent of names, dates, and corporate malfeasance. She had tried to report it to her direct supervisor, who had dismissed her concerns. 2 days later, her apartment was broken into, her work computer stolen. She knew then that they were on to her. She copied everything she could find onto a secure drive, resigned from her job, and vanished, moving from city to city, paying in cash, never staying in one place for more than a week. The men watching them weren't just private investigators. They were corporate enforcers, men paid to intimidate, to silence, to erase problems. "They don't want a scandal," Claire finished, her voice hollow. They want the evidence, and they want to make sure the only person who knows how to decipher it can never talk. Now Ethan understood the depth of her fear. The reason she couldn't go to the authorities. A corporation like Omnigen wouldn't just have lawyers. It would have influence, power, that could reach into every corner of the system. With the truth finally, terrifyingly, laid bare between them, Claire seemed to make a decision. She stood up and walked over to the faded canvas bag, which had sat untouched in the corner of the room since her arrival. With unsteady hands, she unzipped it. Ethan had assumed its weight came from clothes or books, but the contents were far stranger. It was mostly filled with old bundled newspapers and a few heavy, hard-cover books, acting as ballast and padding. But nestled in the very center, wrapped in a thick wool sweater, was a small, hard-sided case. She placed it on the coffee table and opened it. Inside, cushioned in foam, was a single, tiny object, a silver USB flash drive. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of what it represented. "This is everything. The financial records, the buried safety reports, the internal emails. It's all here. Encrypted, but it's here." This was the dangerous clue. This was the reason men were sitting in dark cars outside his home. The small, innocuous piece of metal was a bomb, and they were sitting in the blast radius. He looked from the drive to Claire's terrified face, and then he thought of Lily, sleeping peacefully in her room. He had let a war into his home, and this tiny silver drive was the only weapon they had. The question of what to do next hung in the air, heavy and menacing. The air in the room was thin, brittle. The small silver drive on the coffee table seemed to absorb all the light, all the sound. It was the physical manifestation of their fear. Outside, a car door slammed, and both Ethan and Claire flinched. The threat was no longer a vague possibility. It was a man in a dark coat. It was a black sedan, parked in the shadows. They were being hunted. The slow creeping dread of the past few days had sharpened into a point of immediate, ice-cold panic. There was no more time for quiet contemplation. No more time for secrets. Every second they wasted was a second their hunters were using to close in. "We have to do something," Claire whispered, her voice tight with strain. "We can't just wait for them to—" "Stop!" Ethan cut her off. His voice was sharp. The image of the man watching his window was burned into his mind. The image of Lily, sleeping, oblivious. The pieces didn't add up. The risk he was taking for a stranger was astronomical, but the connections, the lullaby, the scar, felt too deep for chance. He needed the whole truth, now. "This isn't just about a corporation," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "This is about you. I look at you, and I feel like I know you. That song you were humming, my wife used to sing it." He took a step closer, his gaze dropping to her wrist. "And that scar, I've seen it before. A long time ago, on a little girl, Sarah's sister." He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes, the desperate search for another lie. He didn't give her the chance. "My wife's sister had that exact scar, from falling off her bike when she was 8. But she's dead. Everyone said she died. In the car crash that killed her parents, 15 years ago." He held her gaze, the entire world narrowing to the space between them. "Tell me who you are." A choked sob escaped her lips. The facade she had maintained for so long, finally, completely shattered. The dam of secrets broke, and the truth came rushing out in a frantic, desperate torrent. "My name isn't Claire," she cried, the words tumbling over each other. "They gave me that name. My name is Anna. My real name is Anna." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand the impossible. "Sarah. Sarah was my sister." Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. The room tilted. "Anna, The name was a ghost on his tongue. He remembered Sarah speaking of her bright, feisty younger sister. He remembered faded photographs of two girls with the same wide eyes, one of whom was his late wife. It couldn't be. No, he breathed. Anna died. She's gone. It was a lie! Anna's voice rose, filled with years of stolen grief. The crash wasn't an accident. Our parents, they worked for Omnigen too. They found out what the company was doing years before I did. They were going to expose them. Omnigen killed them to silence them. Her story was a frantic series of snapshots. A screech of tires, the smell of gasoline, waking up in a strange room, being told her family was gone, being told she was someone else now. They couldn't risk leaving a witness, even a child, so they made me disappear. They faked my death, gave me a new name, a new life. They put me in their system, a foster home run by a shell charity. I grew up as Clara, an orphan with no past. The reversal was staggering, a physical blow. This woman was not a threat he had let into his home. She was a victim. She was the key. She was family. The entire narrative of the past week flipped on its head. He wasn't protecting a stranger. He was protecting his wife's sister, Lily's aunt, the last living piece of a family that a faceless corporation had tried to erase from existence. The danger was no longer just about corporate malfeasance. It was about murder. It was about the systematic destruction of a family, his family. The abstract fight for justice had become a deeply personal war for vengeance. As if sensing his need for tangible proof, Anna scrambled to the canvas bag. Her hands were shaking violently as she tore out the books and bundled newspapers. From a slit she had carved into the spine of a thick dictionary, she pulled out a folded, official-looking document. She smoothed it out on the coffee table. It was a set of adoption papers, notarized and stamped, dated 14 years ago. The name of the child was listed as Claire Allison Miller. The adoptive parent was the charity organization he now knew was a front for Omnigen. "This is Claire," she said, her finger tapping the paper. "This is the girl they invented to hide me." Ethan stared at the document. The false adoption papers. It was the final horrifying piece of the puzzle. It was proof of a crime so cold, so calculated, it was almost beyond comprehension. They hadn't just killed her parents. They had stolen her life, her name, her entire identity. The fear was still there, a cold snake coiling in his gut. But now it had a partner, a hot, clarifying rage. He looked at the USB drive, then at the fraudulent document, and finally at the face of his long-lost sister-in-law. They were no longer just hiding. They were no longer just running. They were going to fight back. There was no more room for hesitation. The time for hiding was over. The rage that had replaced Ethan's fear was a cold, clarifying fire. He looked at Anna, truly seeing her for the first time not as a frightened refugee, but as a warrior, the last survivor of a hidden war. In her eyes, he saw the same fire reflected. They had a weapon, a small silver drive, and now they had a target. The question was how to strike. A quiet tip to a reporter was useless. Omnigen's roots were deep and could choke out a story before it ever saw the light. The police were a risk they couldn't afford. They needed a stage. They needed a spotlight so bright it would incinerate the shadows Omnigen had lived in for 15 years. An idea began to form in Ethan's mind, reckless and dangerous, but brilliant in its simplicity. "The mayor is holding a press conference this afternoon," he said, the words coming out fast. "It's at City Hall, for a new urban renewal project. Every local news station will be there. It will be broadcast live." Anna's eyes widened as she understood. There would be no secret meetings, no back-alley handoffs. They would walk directly into the lion's den. A public forum was the one place Omnigen's enforcers couldn't touch them. Their power was in the dark. In the full glare of a dozen television cameras, they would be exposed and powerless. The plan was set. It was a single, desperate gamble with no second chances. They had to get from the apartment to City Hall, a journey of only 20 blocks that now felt like crossing a hostile continent. Leaving the apartment was the first test. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, felt like a direct threat. They moved with purpose, a silent, two-person tactical team. Anna secured the USB drive in an inside pocket of her jacket. Ethan grabbed a spare laptop. They peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Then they looked out the window. The black sedan was still there, a silent predator waiting patiently. They had to assume the building's other exits were also being watched. There would be no sneaking out. They would have to walk out the front door, directly into the enemy's line of sight, and bet everything on the anonymity of the midday city crowd. They walked down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the quiet stairwell. Each landing was a new point of danger. Ethan's hand was clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Anna's breathing was a controlled, steady rhythm beside him. They pushed open the heavy front door and stepped into the afternoon light. The city was a chaotic swirl of motion and noise. For a moment it was disorienting. They didn't look toward the sedan. They didn't run. They turned and joined the river of people on the sidewalk, forcing themselves to walk at a normal pace. Two ordinary people on a busy street. Ethan could feel the eyes on his back. He could sense the shift in the atmosphere as their hunters realized their prey had left the nest. A block down, he risked a glance over his shoulder. A man in a dark coat was moving through the crowd behind them, his pace quickening. The hunt was on. They turned a corner, breaking into a jog. The man followed. They ducked into the entrance of a subway station, the smell of concrete and electricity washing over them. They vaulted the turnstiles, not waiting to buy a ticket, the sound of an approaching train, a thunderous promise of escape. They pushed through the throng of passengers and onto a crowded car just as the doors slid shut. Through the thick glass, Ethan saw the man in the dark coat on the platform, his face contorted in a snarl of frustration as the train pulled away, plunging them into the darkness of the tunnel. It was a temporary victory. They knew the hunters would already be coordinating, moving to cut them off. They got off 2 stops later and hailed a taxi, the final leg of their journey a blur of tense silence, their eyes scanning every car, every pedestrian, for a threat. City Hall was a hive of activity. Reporters and camera crews clogged the main rotunda. Ethan and Anna slipped through the crowd, their faces anonymous, their nerves screaming. They found the designated conference room, a grand chamber with a podium at the front and rows of seats filled with journalists. The mayor was already speaking, his voice a droning litany of statistics and promises. They found a spot to stand along the back wall, partially obscured by a television camera. Ethan opened the laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard, connecting to the room's public Wi-Fi. He inserted the drive. The files were there, ready. Anna took a deep, shuddering breath, her hand resting on the drive in her pocket. This was it, the final moment. They waited for the mayor to finish. As he opened the floor to questions, a reporter from Channel 4 began to ask about budget allocations. This was their chance. Before anyone could stop her, Anna walked forward. She moved with a speed and purpose that stunned the room into silence. She bypassed the line of reporters and stepped directly onto the stage, taking her place at the podium. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Security guards started to move forward. "My name is not Claire Miller," Anna said, her voice ringing out, clear and strong, amplified by the microphone. "My name is Anna Vance. 15 years ago, the agricultural corporation Omnigen murdered my parents, David and Catherine Vance, to cover up the results of their fraudulent safety trials." Chaos erupted. Shouts, gasps, the frantic clicking of cameras. The security guards froze, unsure how to act. Ethan was already projecting the laptop's screen onto the large presentation monitor behind the podium. As Anna spoke, he brought up the first document, a scanned copy of her fraudulent adoption papers. "Omnigen faked my death and hid me away under a false identity," Anna declared, her voice filled with a righteous fury. "They did it to bury their crimes, but they failed." Ethan clicked to the next file. An internal Omnigen email, its subject line reading Containment Protocol, Vance, detailed the plan to silence her parents. Then another file, the hidden financial ledger showing the illegal payments, then the suppressed medical reports from the test communities, a litany of sickness and death. It was all there. A digital avalanche of irrefutable proof. The reporters were in a frenzy, their cameras all pointed at the screen, capturing the evidence that would destroy one of the country's biggest corporations. In the back of the room, Ethan saw two men, one of them the man from the street, trying to push their way out, their faces pale with panic. But it was too late. Uniformed police officers, drawn by the commotion, were already securing the exits, their presence turning the room from a press conference into a crime scene. Anna stood at the podium, bathed in the flash of cameras, no longer a victim in the shadows, but the bringer of a long-overdue public reckoning. 2 months passed. The autumn that had brought the storm of their lives gave way to the quiet chill of early winter. The name Omnigen was now synonymous with corporate evil, its downfall a spectacular public inferno of arrests, resignations, and congressional investigations. The men who had hunted Anna were facing federal charges, their power vanishing the moment the first camera flash illuminated their crimes. The news cycle, as it always does, eventually moved on. But for the 3 people in the small apartment above the daily grind, the world had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The constant, low-humming fear that had been their daily companion was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, steady peace that felt more precious than any treasure. The apartment was no longer a fortress or a hiding place. It was simply a home, filled with the sound of Lily's laughter and the warm, comforting scent of coffee. Anna, now officially and legally Anna Vance once more, had found her footing in this new life. The haunted, hunted look in her eyes had softened, replaced by a calm clarity. She was a constant, gentle presence in their home, her bond with Lily deepening with each passing day. Ethan would often watch them together, a pang of bittersweet emotion in his chest. He would see them at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over a drawing, Lily's bright red hair a stark contrast to Anna's dark locks, and in that image he would see a perfect echo of the sisterhood his wife had once shared. He saw how Lily looked at her new aunt with a kind of reverent adoration, and how Anna looked at her niece with a fierce, protective love. In saving Anna, he had not just brought a fugitive in from the cold, he had given his daughter back a piece of the family she had never known. He had brought his wife's legacy home. One evening, as a hush fell over the city, Ethan stood in the doorway of Lily's room, watching the familiar bedtime ritual unfold. Lily was tucked under her comforter, her eyes heavy with sleep. Anna sat on the edge of the bed, a small book held in her hands. After the story was finished, Lily murmured a sleepy request. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he heard the soft, melodic notes begin. It was the lullaby, the same impossible tune that had once sent a shock of confusion and fear through him, now filled the quiet room with an almost unbearable sweetness. Anna's voice was soft and clear as she hummed the melody that had been passed from her mother to her sister, and now to her niece. It was no longer a ghost's song. It was a thread of love, woven through generations of loss, that had found its way home. It was the sound of a family, broken and scattered, being carefully, lovingly, pieced back together. Later, after Lily was fast asleep, Ethan and Anna sat in the living room, the only light coming from a single warm lamp. Outside, a soft, gentle rain began to fall against the window panes. It was a sound so familiar, yet so completely transformed. Ethan walked to the window and looked down at the street below, the same street where he had stood in a cold drizzle and met a desperate stranger so many weeks ago. The streetlights cast a warm, golden glow on the wet pavement, no longer the long streaks of a menacing night, but a soft, welcoming gleam. The rain was not the harbinger of a storm, but a quiet, cleansing rhythm, washing the city clean. That first night, the rain had brought danger and a world of secrets crashing into his life. Tonight, the rain fell on a closed circle, a warm and protected sanctuary. He was no longer a single father, alone against the world. He was a father, a brother, a protector. They were a family, forged in crisis and bound by a love that had proven stronger than any lie. And as the gentle rain fell, it promised not a flood, but a future, clear and bright and full of hope.